Y'all know we're always going to hype our local theater scene, but sometimes we know people want to get away. That's why if you're headed to the Northeast, I'm going to put y'all on to the Williamstown Theater Festival this summer. From July 17th to August 3rd, among the Berkshire Mountains in northwestern Massachusetts, over 130 artists will take the stage for nearly 100 performances. Some of the offerings include a world premiere from Jeremy O'Harris, a production of Camino Reels starring Pamela Anderson and Nicholas Alexander Chavez, and a new adaptation of a Samuel Barber opera. Discounted hotel rooms are available through June 1st. Go to WTFestival.org and make your plans to immerse yourself in theater this summer.
Today on CityCast Chicago, the Sun-Times is under fire this week after the paper printed a list of mostly fake books that, turns out, were generated by AI. Yikes. So maybe it's a good time to revisit our list of real books that'll help you learn about Chicago. It's Thursday, May 22nd. I'm Simona Licea in for Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. So if you want to fully catch up on what happened with the Sun-Times, you should be sure to follow CityCast Chicago on Instagram and TikTok, where our social media manager, Rick Homuth, broke it down. But basically, over the weekend, the print edition of the Sun-Times included this generic supplemental insert, and that's where this fake summer reading list was printed. This insert was produced entirely outside of the newsroom. Nobody at the Sun-Times worked on it, but the paper didn't label it as third-party content. And, they still let an AI-generated list with a bunch of fake books go to print. But the whole thing reminded me of a conversation Jacoby had earlier this year with Ewing about some of the best, and again, real Chicago books to read.
Dr. Ewing is a writer, scholar, cultural organizer, and one of my favorite parts of her bio, a CityCast Chicago fan. Dr. Ewing, welcome back to CityCast Chicago.
Hey, thanks for having me. I was wondering, have I elevated to friend of the pod? Am I friend of the pod yet?
You are family of the podcast
Yay!
At this point.
Woohoo!
In this club, we all fam.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I got a promotion.
So since we're talking about reading, I want to start off with, what kind of reader are you? Do you read a bunch of books throughout the year and track them on an app? Maybe you read multiple at a time, and some of which will never, ever get finished. How would you describe yourself as a reader?
I'm living the dream, which is that I have hella jobs, but all of them involve reading in some type of way. I teach classes, so I read and reread the same text over and over for that. I write comics, which means, I go back and read whatever the backstories and back issues related to comics. And so as a result, it's really important to me to maintain reading for pleasure. That's very important to me, to also protect my personal reading time. So I always have an audiobook, an ebook. I don't do Kindle. I try to not give Amazon my money. So I actually get my ebooks usually on the Libby app from the Chicago Public Library for the free. An audiobook, an ebook, a printed book, and sometimes an additional print library book, pretty much at all times. I love to always have something on me to read.
I do like to keep multiple things in rotation. Right now, I'm reading a poetry anthology. I got a little hip hop journal. So every day I'm reading a little blurb as I put in a small insert.
I love that. I love that.
I'm trying to do it a my favorite thing that happened every day.
Yeah,
journal,
that's dope. That's dope.
With this hip hop journal that I got actually from Carver 47. But something you actually said in there actually made me feel less, how do I put this? Artificial shame. Because I feel like around this time, I start looking back and saying did I read enough? But you say things like, I read for teaching. I read every day for the podcast. And so no, I didn't read a dozen books last year.
Right.
But I did do a little reading every day. In addition to maybe a comic book here and there, some new poetry, some new short stories. And so as you're listening, please also give yourself that same grace. We're not asking you to read 30 books, 40 books by the end of the year. And I know some people listening going, 30, 40.
I'm that person who, if I go out for a run and then I see that the app wasn't on, I'm like, did I even run? Existentially,
I feel that.
But there's enough things in our life that we track to the ends of the earth. I use an app called Storygraph to track my reading, but that's honestly more for myself. But I think it's really important that reading not become yet another competitive thing where we've taken something that's supposed to be pleasurable struggle supposed to be joyful, and turn it into like a way to feel bad about ourselves.
I love that. So I'm going to ask you some more questions about your reading preferences throughout the conversation, places you like to go in the city to read, but let's get into our CityCast Chicago's best books to learn about Chicago. And let's start with one of your favorite genres to read, fiction. You got a couple of books on your list for us?
I do. So one is The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. This is a book that takes place at the beginning of what will become the AIDS crisis in Chicago. And it is it's interesting. I actually read the book right before the beginning of COVID. And I think it gave me a lot of insight into the kind of human story and the psychology of why people make the decisions that they do in a public health crisis. But it's also just a really amazing portrait of, a neighborhood, a subculture, a time in Chicago that is really beautifully and like very lovingly documented. It's a really lovely book. And it's one of those books that, for me, a great novel is when I finish it and I'm like a little sad that I lost the person, like they're not in my life anymore. I'm not going to be in relationship with them every day anymore. And that's how I felt about, the fictional protagonist of this book. So definitely recommend that one, The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai.
So we got The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. You got another piece of fiction for us?
So sticking with the fiction realm, this is a little bit of a throwback, but the book, The Coast of Chicago by Stuart Dybek, is a collection of short stories. And I'll tell y'all, like some of the books I have on the list today are to understand Chicago in like kind of a meta fashion, in the sense of like understanding the people who've influenced Chicagoans themselves. And so Stuart Dybek is an incredibly influential writer, and he is really, there's some of the aspects of his stories might feel like it takes you to another time, but then there are also going to be things that feel very familiar to you. And I think like when we look at a lot of the histories of the way that neighborhoods in Chicago have been so dynamic, so for example, like Pilsen or Wicker Park, right? The demographics of those communities are not what they used to be. There's a lot of neighborhoods in Chicago that were really shaped, especially by Eastern European immigrants, by Southern European immigrants in the earlier part of the 20th century. And so, Stuart Dybek is really kind of taking us back to that time. And just one of those really relatable fiction authors. And I think like a theme that is going to emerge in a lot of these books also is like Chicago as a working class city. This is a really great place in terms of literary community. It's a great city to be a reader. It's a great city to be an author, to be a writer, to be a literary critic. And I think part of that is because we bring a lot of our working class ethos, kind of like Midwestern sensibility to the work that we write and the way that we write. And so this is definitely a book about that. I remember I had a chance to hear Stuart Dybek read some of his fiction several years ago. And I remember it was a short story about somebody trying to get home in a really, really, really bad blizzard. And they didn't have any money for like the bus or a cab. And man, you just like feel that in your butt, when you have like, all of us have been there to that point where it's like, is this a little bit colder than you thought it was? The sun just dropped and the temperature dropped with it. It's just one of those days. And so, he has that kind of writing that just kind of takes you to those regular moments.
Before we move on to another genre, you got any other novels for us?
Okay, so this is one that kind of like, is it a novel? Is it memoir? It's a little bit of this, is a little bit of that. I would call it like a memoiristic autobiographical novel. And that's Last Summer on State Street by Toya Wolff. It's a really amazing book because, again, it has that combination of a little bit of history, but also like a lot of great narrative and characterization. And it is a book about basically the plan for transformation, which I know y'all talk about a lot on the show. And it is like a coming of age story told through the perspective of a protagonist who is a young girl living in public housing and high-rise public housing on State Street. I want to say
the Robert Taylor homes.
Yeah, she lives in the Robert Taylor homes. And so it's a really beautiful book because it takes this really important historic moment in Chicago history that has shaped so much of the fabric of, the world we live in now. And how many times you talk about things on the show that still go back to the plan for transformation issues with CHA. But it really does it in this very personal, very approachable way. And yeah, it's a lovely book.
I don't know about you, but my spidey senses is tingling because our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is swinging straight into the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry. Marvel Spider-Man Beyond Amazing, the exhibition, lets us explore the world of one of the most popular superheroes of all time. We can see rare comic books, props, and costumes from the Spider-Man movies, interactive installations, and life-size statues of characters like Miles Morales, Ghost Spider, and of course, Peter Parker himself. Fans can trace Spider-Man's story from its first comic book appearance in 1962 to its latest runs in TV, billion-dollar movies, and of course, my absolute favorite video game to play on the PS5. Don't miss Marvel Spider-Man Beyond Amazing, now open through February 8th, 2026 at the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry. Tickets on sale now at msichicago.org. Step right up. Cats is under the big top in Paramount's reimagined take on this legendary musical. That's right. The Tony Award-winning musical is at the Paramount Theater in Aurora, and audiences have been loving it. And sure, maybe you've seen Cats before, but trust me, you ain't never seen it quite like this. This circus tent of Jellicle Cats is a spectacle of contortion, acrobatics, juggling, and aerial feats, featuring the cats you know and love like Mungo Jerry, Bustopher Jones, and more. Running through June 15th, Paramount Theater's production of Cats is set to enchant a whole new generation. Get your tickets today at ParamountAurora.com. And hey, use the code CityCast for $5 off per ticket, up to 4 tickets. That's my gift to you. Let's move over into some nonfiction. What are a couple of books people should definitely... man, you got the Birdman hands going the minute I said that.
I know. I'm geeked. You know, people who come to my house complain because in my guest room I have like, oh, here's some books to learn about Chicago. And they're all like incredibly depressing. They're all like, yes. Like, here's 7 books about segregation. So my challenge here was to not do 7 books about segregation. But you know what? You knew who I was when you invited me on the show. So it is going to be what it is.
I 100% did.
It's going to be what it is. Okay, so I want to start with a book called Occupied Territory by Simon Balto. And it is a book that is a history of the Chicago Police Department. But what is interesting and I think a little bit different about this book is that Simon is a historian and he argues that, you know, a lot of times we think about the expansion of policing and mass incarceration as something that really began with the war on drugs. And he says, actually, the Chicago Police Department has this history that goes way back before that. And so his book kind of begins before the 60s and 70s. You can't really understand Chicago without understanding policing. But I will say the other side of that kind of related is a book called The Torture Letters by Lawrence Ralph. And that is a book that is also about the history of police torture in Chicago, but it connects it to Guantanamo Bay and kind of global regimes of violence in general, which I know sounds incredibly depressing, but I will say that it's called The Torture Letters and it's literally written as letters. And so it's also a book that's very tender, a little bit more approachable on a human level, whereas Occupied Territory is really just that kind of deep history. So hopefully those are two different angles. And I'll throw in another one that is not about police torture, or like the history of police oppression and violence. And that is Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win by Helen Schiller. That is her memoir of her time as a city council person rooted in the Uptown community. And so in getting that, you're really getting that history of, you know, like fighting the Chicago machine, a little bit of history of Uptown. I think that's a nice little inside scoop into some of the Chicago politics backstory that everybody wants to know.
Do you find it as a scholar particularly challenging to tell like really joyful stories of Chicago's history when that underbelly of segregation, of police violence, of the type of violence people were met with when they got here on the other side of the Great Migration is always sort of bubbling up underneath the surface and at present?
The same tools of oppression that have harmed us and have made, in some ways, life in the city so hard and so unfair, have also, again, for better or for worse, taught us a lot of skills of mutual aid, reliance upon one another, community relationships, strategies for organizing. There's a reason why we have some of the best organizers, some of the strongest activism anywhere in the country, and people from all over the world come to Chicago and learn about what it looks like to have, a really thick web of community relationships and to be able to respond to different political circumstances. So, but I think also just like the joy, the food, the music, the dance, all of that. And actually that leads me perfectly into my next recommendation, which is I want to recommend a book called To Washington Park with Love. And it's actually a book of photos. And it's by a photographer named Rose Bluen. And I feel really proud to say I had a small hand in this book. And so what happened is that one summer in the 1980s, Rose went to Washington Park almost every day in the summer and just took pictures. Took pictures of kids, took pictures of people playing sports, took pictures of festivals, the Bud, all of that. And she developed all those photos, and I got a chance to see them in an exhibition. And I was like, yo, this should be a book. So I was able to connect her with some folks at Haymarket Books. And now this book is out in the world, and it is just an incredible collection of photographs. And
these pictures
they're amazing, right?
So beautiful.
They're so beautiful. And it makes you look at Washington Park through a different lens. Like some of these photos could have been taken literally at any time, like, a bunch of kids kind of like leaning into the water. And then some of them you're like, wow, look at how many people are just out having fun and feeling joy in Washington Park.
Bro, I'm tearing up looking at some of these pictures, like looking at people play baseball with these throwback ass uniforms. My homie
right, and the Jerry curls, a lot of Jerry curls.
I was going to say full Jerry and some Capri jeans, the old school Adidas fits with the straight line through the side and the gold chain.
I also think it's a reminder to all of us that, the things that are everyday life that we take for granted is really worth it to archive those things and record those things.
I mean, speaking of picture books, I was thinking about a few in the lead up to this conversation. Ones like Lee Bay's.
Yeah, Southern Exposure. Definitely recommend that one.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing you say that reminds me of an amazing collection. Dawood Bey, who's a photographer, he has a collection of photos called Class Pictures, which is photographs that he took across the country of just like portraits of young people, portraits of adolescents. But several of the photos were taken in Chicago in the 90s. And they're just so beautiful, And again, it's one of those books where the everyday life that we really take for granted, like these young people and just the way that they looked during this really changing period in their life, now really captures something from history. And it's very special. He's an amazing photographer. So that's one I would recommend people check out as well.
Are there any books that you read and they better explained the life you were living? Ooh. As a person who grew up in Chicago, that they put into words experiences you had, things you saw that maybe up until reading them, you didn't know words existed for them?
Yeah, I said earlier that like some of this list is about just helping to understand how Chicagoans become Chicagoans. And so, Gwendolyn Brooks and Blacks, she has a lot of different collections, but Blacks is the deepest anthology of her work that collects a lot of her work over many different decades. And so it can be a little bit hard to find in terms of the print run, but look for it at the library or look for a used copy, because I think definitely reading her work helped me understand who I was as a Black person, who I was as a Chicagoan, who I was as a Black Chicagoan, but also who I was as a writer, who I was as a Black Chicago writer, right? All those things kind of interwoven. And I think that in many ways, her and she in her own way is drawing on the tradition of Carl Sandburg. I would say both of them are kind of like the OGs of, whether people know it or not, those two are kind of like the OGs of all Chicago literature, in my personal opinion. I would add Sandra Cisneros as kind of like the third part of that trifecta, where like I think so much of our storytelling and literature goes back to those three. And I think what they have in common is not only, yes, like you said, did they help me understand who I was and who I am, but really that they told the stories of everyday people. And when you read those works when you're a younger person, it kind of disabuses you right away of the idea that like you need to be a special fancy type of person for your story to be worth telling.
Before we move into poetry, were there any other nonfiction books you wanted to mention?
I want to throw in a book called Brown in the Windy City by Lilia Fernandez, which is the history of Mexican and Puerto Rican immigration to Chicago starting in the post-war period. And again, I think this is just like part of the fabric of how the city is that we can often really take for granted, but actually taking a step back to understand that history, I think, is really important.
Did you have any poetry collections, anthologies that you wanted to? Why am I even asking? Let us get into some good poetry you wanted to put on people's lists.
One is a collection called Respect the Mic. And it is a collection of poems from young people, alums affiliated with Oak Park River Forest High School. Now, I know that is like a little bit coming on the podcast talking about Chicago and it's about Oak Park, but hear me out. Many, many incredible young people have gone through this particular poetry program that was run for a long time by a teacher named Peter Kahn, who was a mentor and an educator to generations of young people. And the book includes work by Langston Kerman and Iman Shumpert and other people that basically you didn't know that they were like poets on the low who came through this. And so it's a really nice portrait of so many young people in Chicago get into writing as part of their self-expression. There's a lot of young people who are writers who then don't become professional writers, but it's still part of who they are and a big part of our culture in the city. So that's one that I will recommend. I also want to throw in Citizen Illegal by Jose Olivares, which is also really about, the kind of straddling the line between Mexican culture, American culture, and the way that Chicago kind of like synthesizes both of those through political and social aspects. It also has an amazing cover with art by Scent Rock, who's a great Chicago artist. So that's a collection people should check out. And then I'm going to throw this into the poetry pile, even though it's like poetry, it's prose, it's fiction, it's a lot of things. If you've never read House on Mango Street, or if you haven't gone back to it since you were in 7th grade or whatever, no shame in that game, but definitely worth revisiting. It's really like one of the most influential Chicago books ever written. Or if you're a transplant and you're like, I don't know what that is. Is it a book about a street full of mangoes? No, it's a fictional street. But that's a great one to check out. And then while we're in the poetry category, I'm going to slide on over to theater and just say another one that's in the like, if you haven't read it since 7th grade, or if you're a transplant and never read it, A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. It's one of those things, there's a short list of things in life that like, when you really encounter them, you're like, wow, this is not overrated at all. Like, this is actually as amazing as everybody truly says it is. Like, people said it was fire, and it's fire, right?
I've watched A Raisin in the Sun on TV, community theater, off Broadway,
oh yeah,
university. I've
somebody's
seen it done
8th grade assembly, somebody doing the Beneath a monologue at their After School Matters performance. Yeah, but go back to the text. It just has so many amazing lines that you'll find yourself quoting it like it's The Sopranos later on. Like, in my mother's house, there is still God. Like it's just it's great. And then it also like has these archetypes that are still so resonant of like the bogus relative who's trying to make like bad investments and is going to squander the whole family's money, and then like the long suffering elder who's like, I'm really tired of y'all, but I can't ever like take a break because you're like trying to send me to an early grave. And then the like upstart, overly radical, one who like thinks they're like woker than everybody else because they, like just all those archetypes are still there.
So we can't leave out young people in this conversation. You got any books on your list, whether it's graphic novels, comic series, young novels for young readers?
Yeah, so I'm going to throw in one by Kekla Magoon. And this is a novel called The Rock and the River. It came out over 10 years ago now, I would say, but it really made an impression on me. So The Rock and the River is a novel for young readers. It takes place in 1968, right before the Democratic National Convention. And it is about two different brothers in a household. The father is really raising everybody in, the tradition of nonviolence and the spirit of Dr. King. The protagonist's brother is getting very involved in kind of radical political and social movements with the Panthers and so on. And it's just like a period in history that, I think we have a lot of fiction for young people that is about the civil rights movement. We talk a lot about the civil rights movement in the 50s and the early 60s. But that kind of broader question of, more radical political movements and what is your place in them as a young person is one that I think isn't addressed as much in fiction. So I really liked that book, The Rock and the River by Kekla Magoon. One is The Battle of Lincoln Park by Daniel K. Hertz. It is about the history of Lincoln Park, how it used to be, how it got the way it is now. And then I also want to throw in a graphic novel. You can get the graphic novel now collecting several of the comics. It was a limited run comic series called 8 Billion Genies, which is by Charles Sewell and Ryan Brown. Ryan Brown is a Chicagoan. And 8 Billion Genies is a comic series in which one day every single person on Earth gets their own personal genie. And so, what happens? Chaos ensues. It's really creative. It's really clever. It's really moving. And it's just a fun kind of different perspective. And the opening takes place in a dive bar that seems very much like a Chicago dive bar. So that's the other Chicago connection.
Quick lightning round before we get out of here.
Yes.
Couple of your favorite places to get books in the city of Chicago.
The Chicago Public Library. Find a branch near you. But I like the Blackstone branch, which is the original branch library. And then also big fan of Myopic Books and Quimby's are two great bookstores that I love. But there are so many.
Yeah, they're both up in Wicker Park. I knew you were going to say the library, so my follow-up was going to be favorite library, but you got Blackstone in there, which is one of my favorites as well.
Harold Washington Library is my favorite library, but that's kind of a cheat. But if you go to the Blackstone, if you just want something beautiful to look at, the Blackstone Library has this lattice metal work upstairs section that is just really charming. And it's a tiny little branch.
Where are some of your favorite places to read that aren't the library?
That aren't the Harold Washington Library, which is the first thing I was about to say. The Point, love to read at the Point, love to read at Promontory Point. Also love to read on the train, love to read on the bus. I think that some of that is just for nostalgia reasons, right? I like to read in any random cafe that I haven't been in before, in a neighborhood that I don't go to that often. So just, I'm around, let me just see where I might post up and sit and read.
And if somebody wanted to pick up your latest works, what can they expect from you either most recently or maybe something coming up soon? I don't know.
Oh, well, okay. So I have a new book that is the longest of any of my books that has ever taken me to write. I'm extremely proud of it. The book is called Original Sins, The Miseducation of Black and Native Youth and the Construction of American Racism. It is a very approachable nonfiction book that is about the history of schooling in the United States and how even though we think about schools as helping us overcome racial inequality, that they actually have done a lot to normalize and perpetuate inequality. I have been writing a comic series called Exceptional X-Men that is about 3 teenage mutants living in Chicago. It's my first X-Men title, and it's really fun for me to have these teen mutants. One of them, her code name is Bronze, which is a not so thinly veiled reference to Bronzeville. And they're all really dope. I love them so much. It also features the character of Kitty Pryde, or Shadowcat, as some people know her. And she's bartending in Bridgeport. And so I get to write some pretty cool, little Bridgeport scenes. There's a scene in one issue where a bunch of Cubs fans come in one weekend and they're like, why are all these Cubs fans here? It's now somebody's going to break somebody's nose. And it's they're on this the party bus, and the party bus's driver is cousins with someone who went to high school with the bartender's owner's sister. And so they get a deal, but now it's all these Sox fans and Cubs fans and they're about to fight. And so, everybody who reads that, who's a Marvel Comics fan, is not going to get that. But as with all my stuff, I hope that Chicagoans will be okay, I feel a little seen here.
Come on. Before we get out of here, please join me in thanking our guest today, Dr. Eve Ewing, family of the show.
Thanks for having me. And I hope that people will hit you up and tell you all the great Chicago books that they have been read in the last year or that they're looking forward to for next year.
And some good news before we let you go. The sun will come out tomorrow, or maybe even today. In any case, this chilly rain we've been seeing is set to clear out ahead of Memorial Day weekend. Personally, I'd like it to be a little warmer, but hey, we take what we can get. That's it for today. Jacoby will be back tomorrow with our Friday News Roundup. We'll talk to you then.
It's a really beautiful book if you're looking for, a gift. I gave it to like 6 people for Christmas this past year. It's one of those
give
just
it to
like go
myself
to
right now. Right
well, you
now.
can't love others before you love yourself.